Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's presentation on breaking the stigma, building a supportive workplace for mental health. My name is Akram Mahani, and along with my colleague, Dr. Daniel Dickson, we are pleased to welcome you to today's presentation as your event moderators. The Johnson Shiama Graduate School of Public Policy, or JSGS for short, is a national hub for advanced study and research in public policy administration. We are a partnership between the University of Regina and University of Saskatchewan that was based on the spirit of cooperation and collaboration that defines Saskatchewan. Since our inception in 2007, we have swiftly become one of Canada's leading policy schools for educating graduate students and public servants interested in and devoted to advancing public value. At this time, I would like to acknowledge that while today's event is taking place online, JSGS physical homes are located on Treaty 4 and Treaty 6 territories. These are the original lands of the Cree, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. We are glad to welcome those of you joining us today from across Turtle Island and make this acknowledgement as an act of reconciliation and gratitude to those whose territory we reside or are visiting. I encourage you to take a moment to reflect on the land you reside on and think about and express gratitude for the place and for the people who have safeguarded it throughout time. If you feel comfortable, you are welcome to share your land acknowledgement through the chat, and as you do, please think about actions we can identify to actively engage in reconciliation to honor the land and its people. For those of you who are new to the EDI discussion series, I'm pleased to welcome you today. This series focuses on engaging current and future public servants on issues pertaining to equity, diversity, and inclusion in the public sector. This series is proudly supported by the Maxwell Foundation, who encourage the development of forward-looking innovation that impact public policies and practices. If you would like more information on the Maxwell Foundation and their work, please click in the link in the chat. And my colleague Karen has put the link in the chat. Today's discussion will focus on how organizations can foster supportive and inclusive workplaces that prioritize mental health and well-being. Our speakers will be sharing information on topics that may trigger or re-stimulate trauma to those attending today's event. We recognize the need for safety measures to minimize the risk associated with triggering. If you are experiencing distress as the result of this presentation, please look in the Zoom chat for a list of resources.
Okay,
Now,
to help our,
yeah,
I'll take
I'll
over.
turn it over to you, Daniel, to introduce speakers and also talk about the format of today. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you, Akram. Thank you. So to help our event run smoothly, we ask that all attendees stay muted and turn off their video during the first part of the event. Feel free to turn your videos back on, though, for the Q&A at the end. The format for today's event is as follows. Following speaker introductions, Akram will pose some questions to our panelists that will help us dig into some of the broader issues. This will give you, our audience, time to come up with questions for our panelists, and following this, we will open it up to audience Q&A. If you would like to ask a question, please use Zoom's chat function to send your question to me, Daniel Dickson, and I will pose your question to our panelists. Feel free to submit questions at any time during today's event. And if you have any logistical questions during the event, please don't hesitate to send a message to Karen Jasser-LaForge via Zoom's chat or email her at jsgs.events@uregina.ca. You'll be able to find her contact information in the chat. Please note that as with all of our EDI presentations, this presentation is being recorded and will be available for viewing on the JSGS website at a later date. Okay, so now that the logistics are out of the way, I'm very pleased to introduce today's speakers. First, we're joined by Dr. R. Nicholas Carleton from the Department of Psychology at the Faculty of Arts, the University of Regina. Dr. Carleton is a professor of clinical psychology. He focuses on the mental health of first responders and other public safety personnel. He has published over 270 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters and has been awarded over $100 million in competitive funding. He's received prestigious recognitions, including induction into the Royal Society of Canada's College and as a fellow of the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences. He is principal investigator for the RCMP longitudinal PTSD study and extension studies, and he's also a co-investigator for the National Internet Cognitive Behavioral Therapy Program. We're also joined by Andrew Love, who's a registered social worker and executive director at Pine Lodge Addiction Recovery. Andrew is a community-based health leader and advocate focused on systems change in addictions. Through years of frontline mental health and addiction work and lived experience, he gained an intimate understanding of the challenges faced by individuals seeking treatment. He's committed to working collaboratively with all to ensure that people suffering from addiction can access quality services with minimal barriers. Welcome to our speakers, and I'm pleased to turn it over to Akram to begin the moderated question and answer.
Thank you, Daniel. Okay, maybe we start with you, Nick, with the first question. And to begin, I think let's take a step back and look at the broader landscape. And I would like to see from your extensive research on mental health in public safety personnel, what are some of the key systemic barriers that organizations face in supporting employees' mental health?
That's a terrific question. Thank you. And I'm delighted to be here. I think that there are a variety of different key barriers that come at the organization at different levels. So in no particular order, let's start with, there seems to be an increasing acceptance of what I think is a false latent notion that humans, that us individually, we can support infinite increases in efficiency. So we can keep doing more and more and more with less and less and less, because we believe that, it's just a matter of working more efficiently and more effectively forever and ever. Human beings simply don't function that way. None of us do. And so as we begin building those kinds of latent ideas into our policies and our procedures, they can be insipidly sneaky with respect to how they filter into our expectations for ourselves and for our colleagues and for the people who we're supervising and for the people who are supervising us. All of this, quite often, this focus on doing more and more with less and less, the race towards efficiency, even through human beings, often appears to be in pursuit of driving down short-term costs for any number of reasons. And I think we often do that without paying enough attention to the long-term costs of that forced pressed immediacy and urgency towards efficiency. So I think that's one of the major things that organizations are facing. Now, I can understand, though, also at the same time why the organizations are struggling with that, because they're receiving external pressures as well to do exactly that, to be increasingly ever more efficient. And they're often also dealing with crisis management opportunities like we all encountered as a function of not only COVID-19, but all of the fallout thereafter. So they're often being faced with an immediate short-term problem or an immediate short-term opportunity or challenge that needs an immediate short-term resolution. And then they're often being forced to jump into the next short-term challenge and the next short-term challenge. And so they end up on a perpetual treadmill, if you will, that doesn't allow for long-term planning and doesn't allow for the kinds of breaks and forethought and acceptance of our humanity that I think is so important and has been lost. So those would be my first thoughts, actually, for some of the major challenges that organizations are facing at that systemic structural level.
Thank you so much. That was super helpful. Andrew, I want to pose the same question to you from someone who has experience of working in addiction recovery. So in your view and from your perspective, what are some of the most common workplace challenges and barriers that people, especially those who return to work after a period of after a period of recovery, what in your view, what are the key challenges and barriers?
Yeah, returning to work after completing a recovery program, it presents numerous obstacles for people. And like Nick said, there's some of those, organizational barriers. There's the pressure coming from your funder or maybe your shareholders or whoever to be efficient, be effective. So many employees face sort of outdated judgments from colleagues and superiors, sort of mistaking this association with a recovery journey as being unreliable or a relapse is imminent. So policies too, rigid work schedules, they leave little room for the necessary adjustments for people to make in the difficulties in recovering from addiction or mental health crises. You'll see individuals needing more accommodation, and that their mental health states do fluctuate in that period of recovery. So if they're returning to work too early, they're going to need more sort of recovery time. And that leads to kind of the second part of it. A barrier people face is their own barriers, where they have an expectation just based off of, their employer's expectation or their disability program's expectation that they're going to return to work right away. Zero accommodations. You've gone through a recovery program, you're good to go, get back to work. But recovery is a journey. We talk about this in the recovery world, like being in a recovery center, it's a simulated environment. All your basic needs are taken care of, and you're focused on one thing only. The second you leave this door, that's when recovery is starting. You're now faced with the same challenges that you had before, but now you're sober. So you're going back to work, you're taking care of your kids, you're paying off your SGI, DUI, or whatever you have, all of these things without the comfort of substances. So, people get into these situations where they go back to work and then it leads to self-doubt and anxiety about maintaining their progress in recovery while still handling their professional responsibilities. So ultimately, if we have employers that are more educated, I guess, on how recovery works, what that looks like, a little more flexibility in that, maybe working with vocational rehab consultants to do more more informed return to works, we'd see a lot more success because people are ultimately sealing their fate when they do come back to work early. They do become unreliable. They do become a liability because they are in early stages of recovery and they're not able to focus on what they need to focus on because they're trying to accommodate everything else. And ultimately, that does sometimes lead to relapse.
Thank you so much, Andrew. And you started talking about some of the solutions, and I think now we have a much, a better understanding of or better picture of the barriers and the challenges. I think we can explore some potential solutions now. Andrew, Nick, I start with you again for solutions. In your view, as someone who has extensive research in this area, how can evidence-based interventions be better integrated into our workplace mental health programs? Here, we would love to hear some practical evidence-based strategies to address some of the challenges you and Andrew just mentioned.
Well, I think it's a huge question, and it depends in part on the organization and a lot of interacting variables. But I want to underscore what Andrew just said, that a lot of this really starts with education and having a much better understanding of how mental health and how addictions work and what the reality of the environment that people are working in looks like. I think that education piece is huge because there's still a lot of misinformation and misunderstanding and outright disinformation when we start talking about mental health and substance use and addictions and stress and stressors and how human beings can work. At the very least, and I guess I would say at a very high level, one of the evidence-based interventions that people can start with is to start by engaging a registered, regulated mental health care professional as part of a large team to begin the planning and the deployment processes, to get a handle on what the organization looks like as a whole. What are the overall scope of the challenges? How many members do you have? What kinds of challenges are you running into? What are the external pressures and the internal pressures that are impacting the people that are working there? And making it a very people-centric, people-focused set of planning, I think is absolutely critical. I also think we need to really fully embrace the idea that mental health and physical health, I mean, health in general, it directly interacts with organizational success. This is not sort of an appendage that you need to manage. And I think there's a possibly an apocryphal quote that's often attributed back to Henry Ford that says something like, "Why can't I just hire a pair of hands?" I'm sorry, but you can't. That's not how human beings work. You're hiring a whole person. And so understanding that you're hiring a whole person and that their success is going to interact with your organization's success means that you're going to need to engage your mental health strategy at multiple levels. So you're going to need to engage certainly leadership. You're going to need to consider logistics constraints and interactions. You're going to need to consider resourcing. You're going to need to do expectation management at the beginning of the system and during the system and throughout the time that you're deploying things. That expectation management, I think, interacts very much with the education that I mentioned at the beginning and understanding what's a reasonable expectation and what's not. And this ultimately means that mental health is not something that can ever be one and done. There's a lot of pressure on a lot of organizations and a lot of people. We need that miracle one and done evidence-based solution where we're going to give everybody this 1 hour, what have you, and then presto, magically for the rest of their lives, there's not going to be a mental health problem for them because we've done our job, we've checked our box. Physical health doesn't work that way. Mental health doesn't work that way either. I can't do a perfect push-up and suddenly look like a bodybuilder at their prime. I can't eat one healthy meal and I'm good for life. It's just not how human beings work. And we need to start treating mental health like physical health, keeping that in mind. And that means evidence-informed solutions that include structural supports, systemic supports, intentionality by leadership, by membership, and the acceptance that this is going to be continuously evaluated, improved, and reiterated. And that, I think, is a huge part of the evidence-based interventions. Beyond that, you can get into more nuanced pieces, but without that broad framework to start the conversation at the organizational level, I think more nuanced, specific interventions become very difficult. Even if you've got the best cases available, I think those become quite difficult. So we're really talking about reimagining, to some degree, how we're looking at organizations and how people will interact with them.
Thank you so much. Nick, you mentioned a couple of times about the role of leadership and the supportive environment, and that was clear. So I'm going to ask another question from you before we go to Andrew. And of course, as you just mentioned, no solution can be effective without a strong leadership and a supportive environment. So what role, in your view, does leadership play in shaping an organizational culture that genuinely support mental health? And which, again, talking about evidence-based recommendation, what evidence-based recommendation do you give to those leaders?
I think the leaders are absolutely critical. I think in the absence of leadership support, most of the organizations are going to run into tremendous trouble, not just for mental health, but I think a leader who isn't creating a psychologically safe space, a leader who is not going out of their way to make sure that their employees and their team members really feel supported and encouraged and that they understand how their value contributes to the organization. I think that doesn't just compromise the mental health aspects of the organization. I think it actually compromises the organization. I think organizations that are focused on people first are organizations that are more likely to be pervasively successful. Having said all of that, that's easy as a quip, right? Leaders and organizations play among the largest and longest roles in reducing barriers and improving and supporting mental health, because they're the ones who have the authority to do the deployment. They can model appropriate behaviors. They can provide and dedicate resources. They can create policies. They can support organizational changes. They can facilitate education, and they can reinforce new behaviors. So leaders who aren't modeling good behaviors unto themselves are going to have a lot of difficulty convincing the rest of their team members to model those good behaviors. Leaders who are demonstrating the kinds of behaviors they want to see from their team members are more likely to get those same kinds of behaviors. At the same time, I also want to caution, though, that we're facing a really complex space right now. So people in my generation and possibly earlier generations, and I guess I shouldn't speak for my whole generation, certainly me, mental health was wildly stigmatized throughout my certainly developing years. And so in many ways, we're now asking leaders who grew up in a very different environment, a very different ecosystem, to imagine a newer, better ecosystem, a newer, better environment for other people, and then to build that while they're imagining it, but they don't have necessarily a role model themselves to draw upon. And we're also being very, very poignant lately with demanding that the leaders produce these changes. And in a lot of the cases where I've had the privilege of talking with several leaders of large organizations, they themselves are having, in many cases, challenges with their own mental health because of the increasing pressures that they're feeling. So they're being told, in addition to everything else that we're asking you to do as a leader, now, by the way, also on your desk is the mental health and physical health of your entire organization. So you better get on that. By the way, we're not going to increase the resources that you have as a leader in order to deal with those things either, but we're certainly going to hold you personally accountable and publicly accountable if you don't get the job done. And this is creating sort of a massive problem. So I think we really need to reconstruct the conversation much more broadly and recognize that we are all on the hook for fixing these challenges, and we need to do it collaboratively in order to be successful.
Wow, thank you so much. Andrew, I'm going to come back to you because we heard a lot about stigma, awareness, education, and I would like to ask you, part of creating a supportive environment that Nick was talking about involves, addressing underlying, biases and stigma that, Nick was talking about. In your view, what misconception do workplace still have about addiction and mental health, and how can they work to break these stigmas?
I think that oftentimes people incorrectly believe that addiction results from like maybe a personal weakness or a moral failure, and that mental health issues are signs of maybe a flawed character. So, again, these sort of outdated views of what mental health and addictions really is. They create barriers and they discourage people from seeking help or openly discussing their struggles. One thing I really loved how Nick summed that up though, but like it really is, leaders embracing these practices, they can create this it contributes to the organization's future and success and sustainability. Really, it's a strategic investment in your organization. We're seeing more and more and more people go on mental health leaves using that time. It is becoming a lot more open to discuss in some workplaces, but it's still very much stigmatized in a lot of the corporate world. You'll see in the trades, and out on the rigs, things like that. So we have a lot of guys, like I said, going back to work a little bit too early. They can't tell their foreman that they're going for mental health support or that they need to go for a counseling appointment. So we need to overcome these challenges and really educate staff again with accurate research-based information. The other thing too is that if we're trying to get leadership to be involved, people like numbers. Deloitte, which I used to call Deloitte up until about 2 years ago, shows that there's a return on investment of $1.62 for every dollar that's invested for a program around 1 year, and that doubles after about 3 years. And it's not just things like absenteeism, it's presenteeism too, right? You have people that suffer in silence at work. They're not motivated, they're not completing their tasks, but they're also afraid to explain what's going on. So not only is their mental health deteriorating quickly, the quality of the work is declining, and you just have inefficiencies on both sides, right? I think that, if we foster a culture of acceptance and understanding, organizations will not only improve their employees or individuals' well-being, but it's going to also create this team cohesiveness and this increase in productivity. I know that for for the nonprofit sector, these things are more open and openly talked about and more openly addressed. There'll be for my organization, for example, a lot of the people that are in the helping professions may have come from an addictions like a personal experience with addictions, or have had mental health challenges, and these things are openly talked about, right? We talk about our EAP programs. We look for benefits for our employees that are going to be supportive, and appropriately funded. I remember at one point I was working for an employer, and the psych and social work allowance in their benefits program was $400, and I'm like, that's great for an introduction to your new psychologist. But like ongoing care wasn't supported there, right? Or your EAP program. Okay, you get 6 sessions with somebody who's, not necessarily in town with you, and then their job is to redirect you somewhere else. So having things localized, having things in-house are going to break that stigma for people. And again, leadership is going to play a crucial role in this. You need to create that environment. You need to model that empathy and model that behavior for your employees. And yeah, it has to become part of your workplace culture. Otherwise, people are just going to hide, continue to hide, and continue to suffer in silence, which, I mean, like I said, is detrimental to the organization and to the person's well-being.
Absolutely. Andrew, as you were talking, I was thinking that you are also talking about, the ripple effects of when you accommodate mental health and addiction. There are, there may be ripple effects, and for sure there are beyond individual support, right? So are there, can you elaborate more on that? Are there any external or intersectional benefits to accommodating mental health and addiction in the workplace? And does it foster greater inclusion for other groups in your view? You already alluded to some of this.
Yeah, I think for sure. I think that again, even like a public perception of your organization in recruitment and retention of employees, right? If they're seeing this culture of inclusion, sometimes individuals are afraid to apply for certain positions because they feel like they're going to have to disclose, their mental health concerns or their past addictions history at some point. And that discourages them from, coming to certain organizations because they've heard things or whatever. So it really does create, it creates a good public perception for you that you're an inclusive environment, that this is a place where you can thrive. Because, I mean, if we're going to talk about hiring people with, in addictions recovery, they're often very resilient, right? They're problem solvers. They've had to come through adversity to overcome sort of their challenges in order to participate in everyday life. So these are skills that can be utilized by employers, and oftentimes they're demonstrated in leadership skills.
Andrew, I think I need to ask another question before we go to Nick for the final. I think this could be the final question, and then we move to Nick for the final question. Despite all the progress we have had so far, still there are some employers that are hesitant to engage with these issues, right? And what would you say to employers who may be hesitant to hire or support employees with a history of addiction or mental health struggles?
I think it's important for people to remember that instead of focusing on their past challenges, maybe you should be evaluating candidates based on their current skills and potential contribution. I think it's a very bad hiring practice to look back at that and use that as the judgment. Offer flexibility. Smooth transitions help employees thrive in demanding environments, right? You need to embrace the diversity of personal backgrounds, and this leads to a richer perspective and improved company performance. So if you accept, employees in recovery, it's not just an act of charity, it's a strategic decision that benefits your organizational growth.
Okay, thank you so much, Andrew. I think we have one more question here, and then we go to Daniel to see the audience questions. But one question, based on your extensive research, Nick, you know better than anyone that evidence suggests that early detection plays a crucial role in prevention. In your view, how can employers better recognize and address early sign of mental health struggles in employees before they escalate into serious challenges?
So that's also a really big question. So let's start with the first piece of the puzzle. Early identification of a health challenge is almost always associated with a better probability that you're going to be able to positively engage with that. Whether it's a mental health challenge or a physical health challenge, if we identify we're having a problem, that gives us an opportunity to start solving it. So early is always better. I think there's lots of different tools and opportunities that can be made available by the employer in order to provide supports. But I think it's important to reframe a bit of this conversation because it's got to be a joint responsibility. So the employer can provide a variety of different tools and options and services, but the employee still needs to be able to have the opportunity, the time, the structural availability, and the willingness to step in and make use of those. And given that we're in a transitional space right now where stigma around mental health is still intense, mental health itself is not fully covered as part of our healthcare system. And so Different people are going to have access to different resources. Even if you do identify that I'm having a problem with a mental health disorder, I may not have access to mental health care then to go do something about it. So I think these challenges sort of interact with each other such that the entire onus can't be on the organization and the entire onus can't be on the individual. It has to be a shared responsibility that ultimately, I believe, our government agents are going to have to step in and provide some supports and some policy decisions therein as well. I think at the highest level, though, I would recommend that all of the organizations and all of the leaders should be mindful of the fact that mental health challenges can demonstrate themselves in a variety of different ways, and that those mental health challenges are probably interacting with stressors that the organization to some degree is either creating or not mitigating or unaware of. So there's a variety of ways that this can happen. So for example, if somebody's got a conduct issue suddenly after 5 years of great behavior, that might be a good indication that something else is going on. And instead of using a punishment model, might be an opportunity to use a Socratic model to have a conversation. If somebody suddenly has indications that they are having difficulties with substance use, remember that in that case, there's pretty good probability that they're using it to symptom manage, and they're using it to symptom manage associated with something involving mental health. So now all of a sudden that can change your frame. Now you need to reach out to somebody like Andrew, or you need to make those resources available then so that you can get them help. I think reframing that conversation is a big part of it, and understanding that we all share our responsibility here is another big part of it. And we might need some bigger culture change elements. Like, do we think that mental health is important enough that it needs to be covered under our broader healthcare rubric? And if so, then let's start building our solutions towards that, and accept that this is going to take time, right? I think that's the one other thing I'd like to make sure everybody understands. It's not a matter of everybody being unwilling and tomorrow we all cast a vote and then the next day, presto, on Monday, mental health is resolved. We're building something new together. And so we need to be patient with each other and with ourselves as we do that, and compassionate with each other and ourselves as we build a better future.
Wow, thank you. Well said. It's a joint responsibility. It takes time. We need to be patient and compassionate. Thank you. And I thought it's one final question, but I think I will miss if I don't ask you one more question about stigma and evidence, because both you and Andrew raised stigma a couple of times. And stigma, as you mentioned, still remains a major barrier in many workplaces, despite growing awareness. In your view, Nick, with all this research, what are most effective strategies to reduce workplace stigma around mental health?
Communication, I think, is the first one, and evidence-informed and evidence-based education through that communication. I think that's the first piece. I think we have to do a lot of myth busting. I think there's a lot of myths that still exist. I think Andrew mentioned this in one of his earlier responses as well. We've got to undo 100, 200, 300 years of myth about mental health, that it's about something internal exclusively to you. You're weak. You've got a glass jaw. You've got a problem. This is also going to interact and intersect with gender, which we would need a gender specialist to really help us with this at this point. But you're going to see that how we treat people with respect to their mental health, with respect to gender, it creates a complicating layer of impact and effect as well. So communication first and foremost, and that communication needs to include evidence-informed education about what mental health is and about what it isn't and about how it interacts with every other aspect of our lives. I think that's the biggest thing. But I don't know, Andrew may have an additional smart area that he wants to add on top of that, and I'd love it if he did.
Okay, thank you, Nick. Andrew, do you have any, what is your take on that?
I would just say also the inclusion of people that are suffering from these, or that have overcome barriers, or in a period of remission from their illness, or in recovery. They're key to the conversation, right? They're the key drivers of what was helpful, what wasn't helpful. They understand better than anybody else, what worked for them and how an accommodation could have led to maybe a better outcome. So we really need that representation when we do anything around these areas. It's like a room full of men making decisions about women's reproductive health, things that, right? Like it ain't good. So we definitely need those people at the table. We need them to be part of this. And people in leadership, there's, I don't go a day without meeting somebody who hasn't either been through Pine Lodge, or had a family member that's been through Pine Lodge. Addictions is affecting everybody, and mental health and addictions is affecting everybody, if not directly, then at least indirectly in some way. So it's not something that is as hidden as it was before, and it is something that affects everybody. But we still continue to have these misconceptions about it, and I think this is driven by bad policy. It's driven by, like we said, we talked about outdated policy and people that maybe have stopped learning at this point. And, we need to get those people at the table as well, because, we need to educate everybody. It's not just the new workforce, it's the old workforce, it's those that are retiring. I think about things like the Bell Let's Talk campaign. For my auntie who lives in Momart, Saskatchewan, mental health isn't on her radar, but she's got Bell Express View satellite and she sees a commercial about this. It's important because now she's like, I should ask my granddaughter how she's doing. Um, little things like that. You really have to cater to everybody. It can't be fully academic. It can't be something that's made just for children. It's got to be for everyone, and it has to be done in so many different ways. We have to look at all cultural aspects before we develop anything, but policy does play a big role. It drives culture, and it also sort of sets regulations for employers, right? What do I have to do? What am I mandated to do? And if we're mandating change and we're mandating conversations on addictions or mental health, and we're mandating that people have robust programs, then we're changing that culture and we're bringing that conversation forward.
Wow, thank you so much, Andrew and Nick. You talked about communication, education, engagement, and an integrative approach, holistic and comprehensive approach. I think we had a great conversation so far. Daniel, I think we do have some question, and I think hand it over to you, Daniel.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks so much for the great responses from both panelists so far. And it is now time to open up the floor to question and answer. We've had some questions come in already that are excellent, but please continue to send them to me through the Zoom chat function. The first that I'd like to address talks about mental health hazards, right? This idea of mental health hazards, sometimes called psychosocial hazards. They're not addressed well in the current Canadian occupational health and safety regulations. The poster asks, they say that Australia has led the way in requiring psychosocial hazard identification and risk control. How can employers identify and control elements of work that are potentially harming people's mental health or perpetuating existing mental health problems? So what can we do for upstream prevention? And I guess I'll start with Nick with that question, but I think both panelists can answer it.
I think that's going to be very organizational specific. So the psychological standard for safety that's available might provide some insights into how to progress with that. But I think for each organization, it's going to be very idiosyncratic based on the organization. So it's possible to have an organization, for example, that is not at all psychologically safe, and you can quickly identify that there are problems with psychological safety and that might be driving the challenges with mental health. But it's also possible to have an organization that is as psychologically safe as possible, except that the external pressures on that organization are compromising them in ways that the organization has no control over. So, for example, the challenges that were impacting healthcare and our paramedics during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. Those are external forces that dramatically impacted the organizations, the paramedic organizations all across the country, because of things that no one had control over. And there wasn't really an opportunity to do a pause in that moment. We couldn't say, could we all please just hold off on this pandemic business for a couple of weeks while we sort out how to manage the backflow problem? I think one of the ideal solutions might be taking a look at the organization and identifying how much flexibility you have to manage a crisis. Do you have enough gap in your people's space and in your policies that if something did go wrong, you've got capacity that is available for you to use or to shift to manage that? I think that would be a good start. Otherwise, I think it does require a lot of introspection and then a lot of perhaps careful support from external groups that have specialization in identifying those risk factors and then figuring out what to go do with them after you've identified them.
Wonderful, thank you. Andrew, do you have anything you'd like to add?
No, I just add that there is training available for, for HR folks or for your occupational health and safety folks on psychological health and safety. And some companies are starting to include it in their occupational health and safety policy. I know that CMHA in Regina used to offer a psychological health and safety advisor certificate, and I know that I think CAMH probably has a program and the Mental Health Commission, but you're right, you need somebody to do that, or you need to bring in experts to, do an evaluation. And I like the idea of bringing somebody in externally to do the initial evaluation because they're coming in unbiased. Where if you have somebody in leadership, you could get some of those biases or just minimization of the impact that this might have on an employee, right? Despite training and whatever, there is going to be that sort of, that little bit of bias involved. So you don't need to be everything to everybody. You can bring people in. It's not your manager's responsibility to be a person's counselor, but it should be the responsibility to get them to the right people that can help them, right? So
that's excellent. Yeah, this actually gets to another question that came up in the chat, which is there's this sort of tension between which side of the organization is best kind of situated to handle mental health issues. So is it HR? Is this through health and safety? Is there a sort of best branch of organizations for supporting, or is a more sort of holistic approach necessary? And I guess I'll start with you, Andrew, because you were kind of just getting to that. So, is it something that's best situated within the sort of HR realm, or is it more in the health and safety realm, or is there top-down leadership that needs to be involved?
I think it depends on if you're employing experts in the area, right? Like if you are, then I think it can be, one part. It could be occupational health or safety, it could be HR. But if not, then it's an organization's responsibility through their policy and procedure to have a place readily available and very visible where people can access those resources. So I think, it's an organizational responsibility. And because, the people are individual, they have different ways of engaging in things. They have different ways in accessing information. You need to have a holistic approach to accommodate all those differences in people.
Wonderful. We have a question here for Nick, and it's about early intervention. So the questioner asks, the barriers that are being created by the stigma and discrimination towards these issues, how can organizational leaders call out stigma and discrimination as prejudice without becoming a target of the organization in so doing? So there's a risk of backlash for people who kind of stick their neck out against these barriers. What are some of the strategies that they can use?
I think a lot of the same strategies that they might use for any other kind of stigma or any other kind of discrimination would probably work very well here. It's just we're further ahead on some of those other areas of stigma and discrimination than we are in mental health in some ways. I guess I would suggest that instead of trying to do it as a top-down, heavy-handed approach, first and foremost, I would encourage everyone to invite their organizations and all of the members of their organizations to help design what a more psychologically safe workspace would look like. How do we make this better for everyone? I've not met very many people working in any organizations in the last 5 years who are saying, you know what, everything is wonderful. I have no stress in my life. Everything is cushy. We've got ample resources and lots to spare, and everything is great. We all experience stress. We all experience challenges. And so by inviting everybody to collectively reframe the workplace as somewhere that is also psychologically safe and recognizes our mental health, I think that can offset the burden that you're talking about on leaders and give everybody an opportunity to take an equal share in supporting that. It's riffing in some ways off of the same question that you asked, that I agree with Andrew's answer. It's all of our responsibilities. So I don't think we can place it solely in any one camp, so to speak, in any one group, in any one silo, and say, this is on you. Mental health isn't on me. Mental health is on all of us collectively. That's how we make improvements.
Wonderful. Along those lines, then, Andrew, we've been talking a lot about sort of top-down approaches to accommodating mental health, but what are some of the ways that people from the front lines, people working in a more sort of interactive role, what are some of the ways that they can influence change and help people overcome barriers around stigma and discrimination, for example, or other barriers with mental health?
Know a lot of frontline folks that are in, and again, I come from the nonprofit world, and I think that, and especially in nonprofit sort of helping professions, this is a lot easier of a conversation in the world that I'm in. You'll have frontline staff that are actively working towards creating psychologically healthy environments, whether they know it or not. They're doing team debriefings, they're doing outings together, like even that sort of that team building things, right? They're understanding each other in that way. I worked for an organization that was having two people go for coffee once a week. You have 15 minutes, you go, you talk. And so you're just meeting everybody, you're seeing what everybody's interests are, things like that, getting to know everybody, humanizing everybody in your office, right? There might be the guy you've never talked to in your entire life, and you don't know what's going on with that person. And you don't know what their baseline is. I'm seeing folks like create AA or NA meetings at their place of work and having open meetings with folks that are in recovery for larger organizations. And they're normalizing that as a thing that needs to happen. And it's so beneficial because you'll have people that come out again that I keep talking about that suffering in silence because so many do. But if you have an environment like that, it's so much easier for people to accept help, to look for help, to understand where to get it. And again, like there's certain things that people aren't going to want to talk to about with their management. When you talk about psychological health and safety, they need a springboard, right? And that's going to be other folks. That's the same with management and leaders. Like you need some sort of outlet because you can't go and talk to a subordinate about your mental health issues, like in a way that you're like trying to receive support. You can talk about it in a way to like minimize the stigma and like to show that you're also human and that this is the way that they take care of things. I tell my staff here every time that I'm going for my psychologist appointment, I'm like, I'm going to see my psychologist. I'm going to come back a little bit less crazy. And we make a little bit of a joke about it, but I also make it known that that's what I'm doing in this hour when I'm gone. And it's something that I do and it's normalized. It's something that I do because we have to. We work in an industry where we're seeing so much trauma. Our days are filled with hearing about other people's trauma constantly. We need to be healthy. We need a springboard, and sometimes that's somebody else, right? So again, just if we're able to have those conversations in that sort of frontline, lower level, have those people collaboratively involved, working around it with each other, and then it also might lead to people that aren't able to say things might say it to their coworker who then can bring it up to their manager or bring it up to their leader or whatever, right? They can be a voice for them or be like, hey, we might want to keep an eye on Brian because he's mentioned he's having some issues, whatever. And then an EFAP brochure ends up on his desk, like in a way, like in a nice way, not confrontational, not outing in any way, because that's still uncomfortable for people.
I think this connects well to what you're saying about that comfort piece. Nick, it also connects to what you were talking about in terms of intersectionality and some of the sort of gendered aspects of mental health. One of the questions we got was in more masculine, quote unquote, places of work, there's heightened stigma around the disclosure and around mental health more generally, right? What kind of resources can people at the leadership level provide to make people feel more comfortable in those hyper masculinized workplaces to disclose and to seek accommodations around mental health?
I think, first of all, I'm absolutely certain that there's gender intersectionality there that's impacting on a lot of levels. If you'll forgive a way oversimplification that I heard years ago that always stuck with me, men are allowed to have any emotion they want as long as it's anger, and women are allowed to have any emotion they want as long as it's not anger. And so that creates, and that's just, of course, a quip more than anything else, but it's a quip that I think can be informative for us. We set up for each other the gender role expectations with respect to emotions, and they're in mental health, and what we're expecting people to do and how we're expecting them to act and interact. And in doing that, we end up confining people sometimes to very unhealthy boxes where we're not giving them access to a full range of emotions or expressions. And that can be really toxic for a lot of reasons. So if the entire environment is structured in such a way that that level of barrier, those levels of confines are baked right into the organization, it's going to take a long time to make the changes that are needed to undo that. But I think it starts by calling out at a systems level, not an individual level, that this has happened. So big we, over the last 100 years, not all of everybody, but the big we overall, we've taught people how we want men and women to interact with their emotions and what tough looks like and what strength looks like. And I think with social media and our contemporary communication abilities, we're seeing that strength actually comes in a lot of different forms, in a lot of different ways for a lot of different people. It's not just one thing. It's not just sort of the classic, immortal Grecian style chiseled god that is immune to all things. Sometimes strength is in showing everybody else that you're just as human as they are, and that you are figuring out to the best of your ability ways to navigate challenges, because that's how you embolden and strengthen your staff so that they themselves, your team, can follow your lead. That starts with communication, and it goes right back to, I think, the exact same core that we keep returning to, which is this starts with our leaders, and it starts with them setting a better example than they themselves may have had going forward for everybody who's coming after. So that's what I would suggest we do, at least at this point, and be patient. This takes generations to change.
Yeah, and the time horizons. I mean, we have a lot of people with us today, right, who are thinking about how do I do this tomorrow with staff that I'm working with. And one of the questions that came up in the chat as well was just maybe Andrew, you can speak to this on more evidence-based recommendations for people, specifically for people who are returning after time off, dealing with a mental health issue, right? And so they may have been in crisis, they may have had a period of just time off necessary to deal with what they're dealing with, what's going on in their life. This person says, from their experience, it was just great. So happy that you're back, and then sort of returning to business as usual. But what are the sort of specific mechanisms for creating those lines of communication with leaders and workers around mental health?
I saw something in the comments that was mentioning, mental health first aid for all your staff. Again, these are things that aren't just important for people that work in frontline service delivery with other people. They're important for people that are working in a call center, that are working on, a construction site. Having these skills are just as important as having other safety skills, right? And so including in your mandatory first aid CPR that you have most of your employees do, throw in psychological health and safety, throw in mental health first aid, put in assist, or which is the suicide, assist is the applied suicide. I'm a trainer in it and I can't even say it. But the other one is safe talk. Safe talk is one that's a lot easier for people to get, because you're not expected to be the person to de-escalate a suicide, but you have the information to pass somebody along to the appropriate resource that can handle it, right? So if everybody feels comfortable and confident in their ability to help somebody, or their ability to hear this conversation and say the right thing, I think that's going to be a big thing. We talk about communication throughout this whole thing, and I think that's a key theme for this entire conversation. And part of communication is an understanding and an education. So employers giving everybody that little bit of education so that they feel comfortable in having those conversations. Because I think that that's a barrier for folks is not feeling comfortable. They don't know what to say to somebody that's just come back. Somebody comes back, they just had a heart attack. Like you said, it's like, hey man, great to be back. Oh, that must have sucked. My dad had a heart attack. Like, did you have to do the little walks back and forth every day? And they know more about it. And it's something that you can see. You can see their physical illness. These you can't see. Psychological illnesses are often, well, like you're not still recovering. The expectation again is that, we can't see it, so we assume it's not there. But again, people are still recovering. If you have a heart attack, like I said, you're not expected to go back to work the next day. And you can see the scars. If you break your leg, you can see the cast. If you have a relapse, you can't really see what's going on in your brain. So I think that, again, communication is at the center of this. And again, around communication, people need information so that they're able to communicate about something.
Okay, great. We have another question about evidence-informed strategies for identifying psychosocial hazards. And then this question pertains to the university. So they say, in a large organization like a university, what is the strategy for identifying psychosocial hazards? And so the person brings up student evaluation questionnaires as a potential source of data, right? You're going to get some feedback there. But that would, I guess, just be on one aspect of the university's business. So what are the sort of, is there an overarching strategy for finding data on where these hazards are, or what is the approach to kind of gathering information on where these hazards lie? Nick, is this something you'd feel comfortable taking on?
Sure, I can give you at least a high level. So if we were doing it for a university system, for example, I would probably bring together a small team at first, and I would assemble that small team. It would probably include a clinical psychologist. It might include an experimental psychologist, an OT. It might include, it would probably include a few other research experts in order to sort of build a small balanced team. Then we would take a look at the organization as a whole and make sure that within that team, they had either already got inherent knowledge about the basic structures of the organization. So you need, I think I saw somebody say nothing about us without us. Yeah, you need to know inside the organization. So do you have a couple of profs there? Do you have a student there? People who understand the basic workings of the organization. And then I think an easy first step, if you're going to be stepping into it like this, is to begin with something like a survey. But if it stands to what we've seen in any other group, if it stands to what I've seen in a lot of the other research pieces that we've done, I think what you're going to find is at least at a high level, some pretty good consistent pieces of feedback. One of the things that we often hear is it's not the insert work specific stressor, right? It's the people, it's the organization, it's the management, it's the interrelationships. Those interrelationships or those interpersonal relationships are huge, but they're impacted by the structures and the policies that are set up in the organization. And they're impacted by whether or not everybody has time to maintain, develop, support, and create relationships with the people with whom they're working. So that survey would have to be comprehensive enough that you could identify all of those different elements, the specific piece elements, the overarching stressor elements, and the relational elements, and then identify which of those have the biggest impact or appear to be having the biggest impact for those people in that organization. Then you could turn around and begin having conversations, I would say first and foremost, with small focus groups asking, okay, so we heard that this is true, that form X causes everyone a tremendous amount of stress all the time, or that policy Y is doing this, or what have you. Okay, well, what are our options to make changes to that? And then after you decide collectively, well, let's try this with respect to a change that could work with everybody, then you have to do the thing that nobody likes to do with respect to change management. You have to then rerun the same assessment to check and see later on if you actually made the change that you wanted. And did it have the impact that you wanted? So we changed this, did it actually make an improvement? That process done iteratively and repeatedly with internal and external supports, that's how we slowly make those organizational changes. And as long as everyone understands it's going to be slow, we might be okay.
Thank you. Yeah, I think this ties into a question another great question. This question actually really had me scratching my head because I look at things very different than the person asking the question. But as I'm thinking about it, what they've said makes a lot of sense too. So they ask about severity, and they say, it seems that we've been talking a lot about kind of more severe mental health challenges in this talk, and they're wondering for some strategies about how to accommodate people with more generalized anxiety and depression, or examples of kind of perhaps less severe forms of mental health. For me, in the disability space, we have sort of the opposite problem where we find that inclusion accommodations are most often afforded to people who are the easiest to accommodate, right? And the ones who are more challenging to accommodate often don't get the same support. So how does severity kind of play into the accommodation of mental health, and what sort of things can be done at the organizational level to accommodate people with perhaps less severe mental health challenges? And I'll pose this to both of you because I feel like you both have insight on this.
I think you're right about saying that most of the accommodations I think that are being made are for less severe cases. That's what I'm seeing anyways. Um, uh, we're like people that are so acutely ill that they're being hospitalized are often going off on disability, and then we're doing return to works when they're in a state of, I guess, less like the immediate crisis is over, and again they're in sort of a recovery path at that point. So the severity of their illness at that
Hello.
juncture is so much less. Again, I think that we are talking about people that are sort of like mild to moderate when we're talking about workplace accommodation, because anything beyond that, we're looking at folks that are unable to function really in any sort of like meaningful capacity. So I think we're just kind of in that space.
Nick, do you have anything to add?
I would echo a lot of what Andrew said. I think that's part of the reality, right? It's sort of like if my job involves walking and I've got a broken leg, then it's a severe enough injury that I'm probably not going to be able to be accommodated at work during part of the recovery process. I think accommodations need to be tailored for the individual needs and for the organization and for what's available and what we have capacity for, still remaining person-centered and person-focused. So, and we can't always, it's not always possible to accommodate all things at all times for all people in all ways. So I think we need to be flexible in understanding how we can best make sure that people are feel valued and supported, and also that there's realistic expectation management on everybody's side. So I might think that I'm good to go in my walking job with my compound fractured broken leg, but I might also need to do a real good personal assessment there and go, you know what, this might not be the best way for me to go forward. Maybe I need recovery support first, and then I can go back to work, or maybe I need to reconsider other options. And that can be hard for us to do with physical health. It can also be hard for us to do with mental health for everybody involved.
Okay, we have a question here about holding employers to account for moments of when they exercise their stigma and discrimination. So are there ways, and could we be more effective in how we hold employers to account for when they are discriminating, when they say they fire someone for disclosure, or say that there's workplace consequences, adverse consequences for somebody because on the basis of their mental health? What are there mechanisms that can be used to call employers to account? Are we looking at legal frameworks, or are there things within organizations that can be turned to hold employers to account? And I'll leave this to Andrew first. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's like legislation that protects us under that, the same way that it protects us with any medical condition. It's a human rights issue at that point, I believe. If there's no accommodation being made, I'm not an expert in legal or anything like that, but to me, we always say it. This is a human rights issue. It's a right for everybody to be healthy and everybody to receive the appropriate treatment with the appropriate time of recovery attached to that, right? And I think the problem with addictions and mental health is that that time varies so significantly from person to person, unlike, the timelines that are given for a cold when you get a sick note or whatever, right? Like the smaller things like that, or even like you said, a broken leg. Like there is an expectation that 3 months from now, after you've gone through, physical rehab, that you're going to be ready to come back to work, where these illnesses are unpredictable in the way that they're going to present themselves 1 month from now, 2 months from now, 3 months from now. And so if the proper accommodation isn't made, then it is a human rights issue. And I think you need to get your physician involved. You need to get those experts involved that can, explain this to your employer or to whoever. Because again, it's like addiction to mental health isn't common knowledge, or the way it presents itself, or the way that the length of time that it takes. 30-day treatment centers were based on insurance, not on evidence-based best practice, right? But people think that you've done 30 days of treatment, you're good to go.
Okay, I have one more question that I will offer to both of you, and I think even though it's quite a practical question, I think the implications are a lot broader. And so it's from a manager, I presume, and they say they don't want to sound insensitive, But the piece that we're not really talking about is the work itself. I want to be armed to help all my staff feel their best and do good work. But if they're struggling and what I'm offering isn't helping, the work still needs to happen and I'm getting pressured on results. And so I think the question that they're asking is, how can I punch up? How can I, how can I take, because they're feeling squeezed, right? They're still feeling this pressure to deliver results. What sort of scripts or tools exist for them to speak upwards, to tell their supervisors or their leaders what's going on and to I guess relieve some of that pressure on the results piece. And so I'll leave this to whoever. I would love if both of you took a swing at it, but whoever feels comfortable to go first, please go ahead.
I guess I'll take a swing because Andrew, let Andrew catch a breath for a second here. I guess my thought on, I think it's a very fair question, and I guess my thought on it is this: whoever is putting pressure on that organizational leader also probably has accountabilities to somebody else that are causing them to put pressure on that leader. And I think part of the way that they can push back is by using some of the evidence-based content that we have, by showing that mental health challenges really are creating problems and that these are human rights issues. And it's not as simple as the work has to get done. So, for example, we can say that the work has to get done with respect to, going back to the paramedic example during COVID, we can say the work has to get done no matter what. Well, sure, but at some point, you structurally run out of capacity. And whatever the organization's deliverables, are, simply fail. If that's the point that this person's at, if that's the point that we're at in the conversation, we all failed a long time before that. That's, I think, the big reality check for us. By the time that person's feeling that way and the organization's moving to a point of failure with respect to work-related deliverables, there have been many failures that have come before then that are not any one individual's responsibility, but are a collective responsibility. If we want paramedics to be available, for example, even in the event that we have a massive pandemic and we have a shortfall of healthcare support, okay, then the tax base has to decide that we're going to invest in that and that we're going to make other sacrifices to make sure that that service and those resources are available. And if we are not willing to make those changes, then we have to accept that there's going to be restricted deliverables from those groups that we're supporting, in which case then we have to own that too. So I guess that would be how I would try and support that leader in punching back, so to speak, or punching up. I'm not sure which punching they're doing here, but in pushing back, because I hear from a lot of leaders that they're under this kind of pressure. But whoever's putting that pressure on them, they have an onus of responsibility on that leader in the organization as well. So that's how I would start, by pushing back, by saying, no problem. I can't breach the human resource and human rights issue, which means we're going to reduce the deliverables. If you don't like that, here are your alternatives. I'll need more resources in order to do this. And those hard lines are going to have to be drawn, especially with what we're looking at with my limited, you need an economics prof here, but with my limited understanding of the geoeconomic political sphere right now, from what I can read in the news, these are real conversations that are going to hit everybody hard and fast for the next decade at least. And I don't have perfect answers, but I do think that we can't burn people out while we try and solve the problems.
I love that idea of bringing in the rights framing, though, in the messaging around that, right? Like, look, this is a serious issue, right? This is not, and so I think maybe some of those pressures would be belayed a little bit if that sort of language is brought into the discussion. Andrew, do you have anything else to add on this, or?
No, I think that was perfectly summed up. I mean, yeah, no, nothing to add.
Agree. Okay, well, then in that case, I will turn it over to you, Akram.
Wow, wonderful conversation, and thank you so much for your questions and for your thoughtful answers, Nick and Andrew. I think we are nearing the end of our time together today. So I would like to take this opportunity to thank our speakers, Dr. Nick Carleton and Andrew Love, for sharing your very helpful insights and your helpful observations with us today on how we can foster a culture of support and ensuring an inclusive workplace for all. I would also like to thank our colleague Karen Jaster, who did organize this event. If you enjoyed this lecture, Please keep an eye on JSGS events calendar, where upcoming events and program information sessions are being promoted. Karen will share the link in the chat box. Please join me in a round of applause for our speakers and also for Karen using Zoom reaction option. And thank you everyone again for joining us, and have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.